What's going on? Welcome inside the Sunbelt Syndicate. This version is obviously the basketball version, as you can see if you're watching the live stream. Now we reference this one as the Round Ball Roundup. However, even though it's basketball, we still are presented by the Dogs Media Network and collegefootballdogs.com as we continue to expand the brand. And let me tell you about our new sponsor. Just a couple weeks ago, we obtained Dubby as a sponsor. They are an energy drink. This isn't your normal out of a can energy drink with all the crappy stuff you can put into your body. This is more like your protein powder, your protein shake. You mix this up as you want to out of a container. Lot cleaner energy. They just came out with a new version called Hydro. It's more of a liquid IV, as they call it. So for those of you that have a little too much fun at football and basketball games and soon into the spring baseball games, grab you some of the Hydro IV for your recovery. This one does not contain any caffeine, but it will help you replenish those liquids that your body needs after having a little too much fun out on the football field or in the stands, I guess I should say, and definitely in the basketball arenas. Speaking of basketball arenas, let's jump in to the coverage from last night. Start by talking about probably the biggest game of the night as far as entertainment goes, because we had a lot of back and forth between Louisiana and James Madison last night as JMU, the ranked team, goes on the road, plays Louisiana down there in the Cajun Dome. Unfortunately, not as many people as I think a lot of them as Cajun fans had hoped and expected to be there. I was a little disappointed when I tuned in to see how few people were there, but I will say, I will give tons of credit to the Cajun fans that turned out and were loud and into the game. There was one guy behind the announcer who was going off with the obscenities, like you could clearly hear it through the audio. So calm yourself down there. But as far as the game went, a little sloppy actually on both sides. Had Louisiana up 12-4 early on. JMU cuts it to 11-12, and then from there it was really back and forth a lot throughout the game. The Dukes only started off 2 of 13 from the field, but obviously as the game wore on, got a little bit better. But I would say far from the Dukes' best game of the season. Certainly not Louisiana's best game of the season, but it was one of those scrappy games. Just like we know from football, both teams essentially were moving the ball back and forth, but just not being able. They just weren't finishing at the basket as well as they could have, or from outside the arc. So it was kind of interesting to see that. But hey, when you win ugly, you still win. JMU continues their winning ways. A little scuffle at the end. That's what we really want to talk about, right? Folks gets into it with Horton a little bit, kind of mid-game, I'd say. Nothing real dirty. In fact, there was 2 separate players who actually received technical fouls on that little scuffle there at that point. And yes, there was some contact between Horton and Folks. I think Folks kind of milked it a little bit, I'd say. Went down a little easier. Didn't totally throw himself a couple feet away, but he went back harder than he probably needed to. And then after that, it was just small, tight stuff. There were not big battles and swinging of arms or anything like that. However, it was the coaches, at least the head coach Bob Marlin for Louisiana, and some, as far as I know, so far unidentified player or coach from James Madison. And being a former official, I can only assume that somebody either shook hands a little too hard, somebody missed the hand on purpose, or there was just a little snide comment given, and that sparked this whole big thing. Luckily, we kept it from getting completely out of hand. But you know what? It's honestly not a bad thing, because we need all the eyes and attention on the Sunbelt basketball that we can get. James Madison's helping do that by being a ranked team right now and going into these venues as a ranked team, giving our conference teams a chance to beat a ranked opponent. Whether you love or hate James Madison, obviously JMU fans love it, but even if you don't, you're getting the chance to beat the ranked team at your place a couple times this year. So it's exciting in that regard. It helps keeps eyes on us, even though maybe it's not the greatest of ways you want to do it. Hopefully, that sparks a little bit more interest as we go along. As they say, all coverage is good coverage, and that in that sense. So not the worst way to start off the conference slate. And I want to get into put together a couple little slides here for us to look at as far as this one goes. So you won't have to see my ugly mug on the screen the entire show. So basketball night, right? We actually know that there is no basketball in the Sun Belt tonight. But it did get started last Saturday with a bunch of games. Pretty much everybody in the conference went. So 14 teams, 7 games last Saturday. We had 1 on Wednesday. We had 6 others last night. We will have the entire slate again go this Saturday. For those that are unfamiliar, it seems to be 1 or 2 weekday games and then the Saturday games. Everything from this past week was essentially on the western side as far as games. So nothing really came to the east. So a little bit later starts, but that's kind of good for those of us with young kids like myself. Usually they can be put to bed before we can start watching these games. I also put in the women's standings. So we're going to take a quick look first at the men's standings coming in. As you can see here, hopefully you can see here, try to fit all this in with a relative ease, but hopefully everyone can see this. Obviously, James Madison at the top of the standings, sitting at 2-0, but we also have App State, Troy, and Marshall 2-0 starts in conference play. Obviously, we expected App State and JMU to have those 2-0 starts. Possibly Troy, if you look at their schedule, makes sense that they probably started off 2-0. They were a pretty solid team last year. Not totally shocking to see them start 2-0. The one that does surprise me is Marshall. Not because I didn't think they could be capable of it, but they had the early season struggles outside of the conference. They look to be rounding into form with that first game victory over Louisiana, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But as far as win streaks go, it's not surprising to see a couple of these teams have streaks longer than 2 games. Obviously, App State had dropped one to Asheville before conference play started, so they have a 2-game win streak, both obviously in conference, as well as Marshall. Again, we just talked about their outside of conference early season struggles before they got going. Some surprises maybe as we get into the 1-1 team so far. It doesn't shock me that South Alabama is 1-1. I'd probably be more surprised with the team kind of below them in Southern Miss. I would have expected them to maybe be 2-0 at this point in the young season. South Alabama did lose quite a bit from last year's team. And as we talked about previously, Southern Miss also lost some coming into the season, probably before the season even really got rolling. So not necessarily fair to judge them just yet as they continue to try and figure things out with the injuries that plagued them really before the season even really got started. But obviously some great talent on the field, on the court there, with Austin Crowley doing his thing on the court. Georgia State, Arkansas State, and Coastal Carolina, as well as the surprise Georgia Southern Eagles, all round out the 1-1 teams so far in the standings. Now, Georgia Southern did struggle a little bit last night, as we saw on the scoreboard. However, they did get the first game victory for their first victory of the season, and obviously so far their only victory of the season. But some promise there in Statesboro, I think, as we move forward. Again, unfortunately, the Sun Belt overall doesn't look quite as powerful as it has in the past, especially last season. So we will continue to see how these teams round into form as they continue to challenge each other and go along in the conference slate. As far as the 0-2 teams, we should mention before we move on, Louisiana, the most shocking 0-2 team. Obviously, the loss last night, as we've already mentioned, but they had a very long home win streak, one of the longest in the nation coming into the game. Unfortunately, they dropped that one to James Madison. But again, hard-fought battle. Not a lot of separation between those two teams when you really watch that game. Actually, I rewatched that one personally today to kind of see what transpired to get to that point at the end with that little scuffle. Again, not even really based on the players on the court, really. It was something extra on the outside that really got into that one. But we have Texas State, also, a perennial favorite these last few years to be towards the top of the Sun Belt, starting off the conference slate 0-2, and then ULM, not surprised to see them 0-2. However, I do want to mention that, again, last year, before conference play started, they looked about the same as they did this year. Conference play started, they started transitioning into a little bit better of a team, and were a very solid team and a very hard out for anybody in the conference last year. Also included in that is the team that's technically listed below them, although tied in the standings, ODU, who was my surprise pick as a chance to get towards the top of this conference before the season started. unfortunately for them, they just haven't been putting some things together. Obviously, their health issue at the head coaching spot is not a great situation. Hopefully, he continues to recover. And scary part was that happened all while they were all the way across the country in Hawaii over the holidays. But they did put a decent performance out over there in Hawaii, especially to me, when you travel that far during the holidays, can't be easy to do what they did, especially with the coaching situation that they had to go through as well and round back into form as a team to compete within that little early season tournament. I almost said preseason, but at that point, the season is rolling. So I would say it's an early season tournament. But they sit at only 4-10 overall on the year as well. So disappointing to see ODU there. I know the Monarchists are probably a little disappointed in that as well, but we'll see if they can continue to round into form. We haven't yet covered anything for the women's side of the basketball, and I really failed to do that last year. And it's just hard to get into the weeds on so many things as an individual. I would love to get more coverage focused on the women's side of the game as well. And hopefully one day soon we can do that. But at the least, I can kind of keep us up to speed with where they are in the standings. So right now, just like on the men's side, you've got the women's James Madison team up there at 2-0, as well as Marshall. It kind of reminds me of the early season part of the men's season last year when Marshall and JMU were up towards the top of the conference with hot starts to start the season. The best team record-wise outside of the conference and just overall, I guess I should say, is actually Georgia Southern, who just dropped their first game the other night, and still very, very dominant team overall. Again, 11-3 coming into the previous game. I guess it was last night's game. We got a ton of teams in the middle, though. So a lot to sort out between 2 and 10. We've got a ton of teams right there in the middle, and they all are sans probably Texas State, who sits at 10-4. Everybody else is just a few games above or a few games below 500 for the most part. There's a few outliers there. Old Dominion's also sitting at 9-3, so probably a little bit better mark there. ULM's 9-4, but everybody else kind of 7-5, 7-8, 5-6. You know, these teams are still learning about themselves, and obviously a little bit different of a game. For those that don't know, the women's side of things plays 4 quarters, more like the true NBA fashion. Obviously not as long in length, but some solid talent out there. As you can see here on the graphic, we've got the best player on the court for both Georgia Southern and App State. That might have been a little bit purposeful because of the history between those two programs and schools in general. But both ladies there putting on a show so far this season. We've got Southern Miss, South Alabama rounding out the conference standings for the women's side, both coming in at 0-2 so far. But again, nothing ugly about the standings for them overall. 7-5 and 7-7 overall. So yeah, I think this women's side is going to be highly competitive as we continue to go on through the early part of the season here. As far as conference play, like we mentioned before, conference play got started last Saturday. Obviously, with the holidays, we kind of took a week off from that. So this is the first follow-up to that. So we will touch on what happened during that opening weekend of play. So we saw ULM and App State matchup. App State takes that one in Boone, 67-55. Coastal Carolina, again, some early season changes for them, as well as their all-time winningest coach and the active wins leader in all of men's Division I basketball, retires early on, so they got some transitioning to do. They dropped their first game in conference to Troy, 72-65. Georgia State just squeaks out the victory over Arkansas State, 91-90 in that one. James Madison obviously came in hot. They continued to be hot in that first matchup, winning that one 82-65. Georgia Southern hammers Southern Miss in easily the most surprising game of the opening weekend conference slate. Again, Georgia Southern's first win of the season, and I'm missing some comments here, so I want to go ahead and stop myself, but yeah, we have Troy. He's one of the editors for College Football Dog, so he's having a nice little laugh at me. So I'll get back to him once the show's done. So sorry to interrupt that there. But again, Georgia Southern, solid performance against Southern Miss. Obviously, once again, just like we've seen a couple times already this season, some of these teams just aren't quite at the point where they are as hot as they will be later on in the season, as we've seen, especially in last season's conference tournament. Some teams can just get really hot and on fire towards the end. That's not happening so far in the early part of the season. I would include Southern Miss, obviously, in that aspect, but still, to drop a game to a winless team thus far coming into conference play, you would think that Southern Miss might round into form and take it to Georgia Southern. Well, it was really the opposite way around in that one. A little bit less of a surprise, as Marshall was very talented last year with some great games against Louisiana. They take that one 75-61 over the Cajuns. And as we mentioned, Cajuns dropping that game last night as well to start out 0-2. And then South Alabama battles back tremendously. I think they were down double digits kind of later towards the game, end up beating Old Dominion up there in Norfolk 61-59. So great turnaround there for South Alabama. And as we'll touch on here in a minute, a great overtime game last night. Unfortunately for the Jags, they fall, but as App State fans are aware, a solid performance there in overtime by the Mountaineers. Wednesday's matchup, we only had one game. Again, most of these are going to be this kind of a situation for the midweek matchups, maybe one here and the rest on another day, or some of times they'll be all on, a Thursday. This one specifically was a Wednesday matchup. So for those that missed it, Marshall took down ULM 68-57. So not as competitive there, but again, helping Marshall to that early 2-0 start in conference. As far as Thursday's games, these ones just happened last night. Most of you are aware of them. We'll run through these ones quickly. Troy takes care of Old Dominion 86-73. Coastal Carolina downs Texas State 71-63. And Southern Miss takes down Georgia State, rebounds well after that first game conference loss to Georgia Southern, and beats the other Georgia school in Georgia State 79-73. As mentioned to start the show, James Madison, our only ranked team in the Sun Belt, takes care of Louisiana down there in Lafayette 68-61. So still a pretty close game. Probably closer than it looks on the scoreboard, if I'm being honest with you. However, Cajuns couldn't take care of it in the Cajun Dome, and some frustration. I think this is going to be a battle. I think these two teams don't care for each other too much. Last night didn't help that. And I think this is going to be one of those exciting matchups that we are going to want to watch and have a lot of interest in going forward, especially once we get closer to conference tournament time, see where these teams end up on sides of the bracket, maybe on the same side for an early one, or maybe on opposite sides, and could be later in the conference tournament and provide us some pretty good storylines going into that one. Arkansas State gets over the century mark on the night, going 109-83 over Georgia Southern. So as a surprising start, as Georgia Southern had to start the conference slate, they dropped the next one pretty soundly to an Arkansas State team who has yet to really proven themselves. So it's really still up in the air on where this Georgia Southern team is going to end up. But they do have one of the better players in the conference so far, at least as points per game go. So we can see what they can do as they continue to evolve as a team with a little bit of a newer roster and certainly a new head coach before the season got started there. And the only overtime game from last night, App State downs USA down there in Mobile 91-84, a back and forth matchup throughout much of the night before overtime led to the Mountaineers pretty much dominating. It just didn't seem like the same game that you were watching just a few minutes prior, as the Mountaineers really took over on the defensive and offensive side of the court to take it to the Jags right down there in Mobile. But the Jags are a tough team. I'm telling you right now, they have right now, as it sits in the conference, the top scorer overall. And I think that's going to be what we're going to get to next. Oh, no, we're going to talk about Saturday's slate real quick. So, as we mentioned, kind of packed in more towards the end of the week as far as basketball goes. And then we have a full slate again on Saturday. The times listed here are Central Times, as I grab this from the Sunbelt website itself. We've got Old Dominion matching up with Arkansas State. If I've got to pick a winner in that one, I'm going with Arkansas State after they just put up 100-plus points on Thursday night. And ODU seems to still be continuing to struggle. Going on the road to Jonesboro to play in this one isn't going to probably lead to any favors being done for them. So I would favor the Red Wolves in that early season matchup. Georgia Southern versus ULM. This one's really more of a coin toss to me. After this last performance, you think Georgia Southern's going to try and round back into what they look like more in that first game against Southern Miss than what they looked like last night against Arkansas State. For that reason, I'm gonna stick with the Eagles of Georgia Southern here and say they get back into the winning ways and maybe to a lot of people surprise with a 2-1 conference start here. So we'll see what happens. But I think they've got a chance to take it to Monroe. But Monroe's not an easy out either. Both of those games, and the next one that we're going to talk about are 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Starts on Saturday. James Madison and Southern Miss. That's the last 3 p.m., 2 p.m. matchup that we're going to talk about. I got to favor the Dukes here in this one after what they just went on the road and did against Cajuns last night. Now they're going to go take on a still kind of struggling Southern Miss team. So I'm definitely going to favor our ranked team in the Dukes in this one. South Alabama, Georgia State. This one will be interesting. Again, after last night, I'm going to favor the Jags to win this matchup specifically. Georgia State still, I'd say they're very similar to really what they looked like last year. I don't think there's a crazy big difference between what I've seen so far from them last year into this season. So they're still working on some things. I'm not quite trusting them. I think South Alabama is a very solid team who just got beat by a little bit better of a team last night in Appalachian State. So I'm going to favor the Jags in that one. App State and Troy. This one on paper, maybe you say Troy hasn't been tested real difficultly just yet, real hard on the conference slate, and that could be true. But this one's not going to be an easy out for App State as they travel on the road down there in Troy, Alabama. As we know, with the football, these two went at it for the conference championship. I don't think it'll be quite at that level for this basketball game, but I do expect a close finish in this one as Troy is obviously still 2-0, App State 2-0, probably one of the better matchups of the weekend down there in Troy, Alabama. 3 Central, 4 p.m. Eastern start, I believe, on ESPN. I believe all these games are on ESPN Plus. I don't know if we've got any conference games that are going to be elevated, such as football had with ESPN, ESPNU. I'm assuming that if JMU continues their run and we've got some teams like App State, if Troy continues their run, or if Marshall continues their run, and you've got some mid-season matchups that they could possibly elevate. But for the most part, all of these conference games will continue to be on the ESPN Plus platform. As a Sunbelt fan, if you don't have it, you might want to look into that. I hate to push things like that without paid sponsorship, but it's just the truth of the matter. That's how we see our teams play. That's how they make it easy. All right. So go and look into that if you don't currently have it. Marshall and Texas State matchup at 4 Central, 5 Eastern time. This one could be a little surprise. I know that Texas State hasn't started where they wanted, and Marshall's kind of surprised a little bit. Could this West Virginia team traveling all the way to Texas, could that be a little bit of a struggle early on in the game, and Texas State could maybe jump out to an early lead, and Marshall has to worry about battling back on the road? We'll see. I don't know what Texas State's environment is like on the basketball court lately. I know they used to have a pretty prominent one, again, with their struggles over the last few years to be towards the top of the conference where a lot of people have expected them to be. It'll be interesting to see if they can put it together and beat a team as talented as Marshall, and as they continue to round into form there for the Thundering Herd. Coastal Carolina and Louisiana round out the night with the only real true night matchup, 7 Central, 8 p.m. Eastern time. I got to think that the Cajuns are going to come in with a head of steam with how they lost that game to JMU. They know they could have played better. Themis Folks heated up in the second half, but wasn't really quite in his game or on his game as much as he usually is in the first half. If he had that kind of performance of a more consistent game against JMU, we probably see a closer one. As far as that argument goes, I'm not talking about that to beat James Madison, because James Madison also had some players who struggled a little bit early on and then heated up as well. But as far as this matchup is concerned, I'm going to favor the Cajuns in this one after what they just went through the other night and wanting to get back into the swing of things, also playing again at home and having Coastal Carolina travel all the way down there to Louisiana. So the one I thought we were going to have just before this, the top 3 scores And you're going to look at me and say, well, top 3 scores, there's 4 dudes on the screen. Yes, that is correct. 2 of them are tied. So technically, these are the top 3 scorers, but there are 4 people in the top 3 positions. Isaiah Gaither for South Alabama, as I just mentioned earlier, is the top point producer so far in conference. I want to reiterate that for those that are looking up stats and double checking me. This is for conference play only. I wanted to focus on the conference play as we get rolling into conference play. We'll continue to kind of round into other metrics and other statistics that include everything from the season. But I wanted to focus on the conference play because we're really getting going in that so far. And I was really impressed with his game last night, hitting some late shots to get that game against App State into OT. Again, he's leading the conference thus far, only 2 games in, so very early, but 22.5 points easily puts him in the number 1 position. DeAndre Dominguez, a University of Massachusetts transfer, UMass, transferred down to Arkansas State. Very impressive season so far for him as he comes in to the Red Wolves team and gives them the spark they truly need. And obviously, again, gets them over the century mark, going for 109 total points as a team. Last night, he's going for an average of 20 points per game so far in conference play, as is Austin Crowley of Southern Miss. That one, and honestly, Austin Crowley being the least surprising player to see on this list, with his game last year becoming well aware of who he was, very extremely noticeable when he's got the ball in his possession, when he's going up and down the court, and easily one of the best offensive players in this conference. If you haven't watched the Southern Miss Golden Eagles, be sure to go check those guys out. Again, some early struggles with the injury bug on the team. Austin, luckily, was not really a part of that, and that's why you see him on this list at 20 points per game. And then another little bit of a surprise, not because of the team they're on, but because it's coming into the conference, Trayvon Spillers from App State, just below those 2 previous players at 19.5 points per game so far in conference play. That rounds out the top 3 of the scores for the conference. And I do want to talk about one thing before we go. And Trevor, who runs a 2 Pointers podcast, again, for those of you who aren't aware, I know that the Sun Belt isn't the biggest basketball conference. Trevor does an amazing job covering basketball in general, specifically college basketball, but also does some NBA coverage as well. And he's telling me Curbelo, yes, also another talented player, as he's apparently watching on Twitter or X. So great to see comments coming in from there. For those that don't know, they didn't really have the ability to let you comment on things early on when we started doing these streams. So it's awesome that Twitter has, or X has, caught on in that regard and is allowing you guys to make some comments without having a verified account, because I don't know how many of you are willing to do it, but I'm not willing to pay for X, or as it was previously known, Twitter. So, and Trevor also mentions that Spillers was impressive in the Auburn game. He knows that because he went up to Boone on his own to go take in that game. And he's not local at all to the area. He's a lot closer to Campbell University, actually, in North Carolina. So impressive that App State is able to get a Power 5. Again, those don't exist in basketball, but we all know what that means. Essentially a Power 5 school to come up the mountain in basketball. Very hard for them to do in recent years. So good to have an early season game like that. And to mention, Auburn is now a ranked team. And I don't know if Trevor's still watching and listening, but I'm not sure how Auburn's ranked, to be honest with you. I looked at their record after that when I heard that that was happening, and they don't have really all that many really impressive wins. When you compare maybe the point margin difference in some of their victories, you can see where people may be a little bit impressed by them, but they don't have a single ranked win that I've seen. And I don't think they have a single victory over a team that has even become ranked as far as I've seen. So they're only right there at number 25, I believe, is where they're at. But surprising to me at this point that Auburn's a ranked team early on in the season with their strength of schedule, essentially. I think they could become very much proven in this SEC conference slate, and we'll see. But Trevor says that win is getting better by the week. they're going to peak in SEC play. Okay. Yeah, I certainly can see that. And I think Trevor would probably even agree with me with this. They had the talent to beat App State that day. They App State, to their full credit, obviously, as this is a Sun Belt podcast, and I'm an App State fan in the background of this as well. They didn't allow them to do a lot of the things they wanted to do, but it didn't seem like Auburn pushed some of the things they might have been able to do as much as they could have in order to try and power through down low in the paint and at least force App State into some foul trouble. They didn't really get into too much foul trouble in that game because they continued to try and attack from the outside a lot, which was a little surprising to see. But again, Auburn's rounding into form, ranked team. So at this point, App State now has a win over a ranked opponent. Again, quotes because they weren't ranked at the time they beat them, but now they are. So again, it'll help App State's strength of schedule as we get further along. One last thing before we really round up, and Trevor also says they have the talent to beat anyone in the SEC. App's defense was incredible. Yeah, and so far App's defense hasn't looked too different in the conference slate, which is good for them. As of yet, they didn't look as great against Asheville when, again, they dropped that game right before conference play started, unfortunately for them. But that was also a factor of, I don't even remember the kid's name, but the kid from Asheville shot lights out, probably has not shot that well in his life on a neutral court in Hickory, North Carolina, of all places, at a literally community college venue where they held that basketball game. A large App State contingent, but unfortunately they dropped that one before starting conference play. So just wanted to go over a preseason poll real quick, reiterate. JMU was first by the coaches' preseason poll. App State, ODU was listed as the third place team coming into the season. Southern Miss just below them at 4, Louisiana at 5, South Alabama at 6, and Marshall actually came in there at 7th. So what I'm going to do real quick before we round this up is tell you where I think those teams stand now if they were to kind of be reordered. I still have JMU and App State 1 and 2. Obviously, with what they've done so far this year, really not much reason to change them. Certainly not with James Madison. I guess you could have made an argument for somebody possibly jumping App State, but I don't see anything strong enough just yet. Any of those other teams. I have Marshall coming in at 3 at this point early in the season, followed very, very closely. This was a very tough one for me to put Marshall ahead of Troy, but when I broke down what Troy has done so far in the conference slate, I thought what Marshall has done just been a little bit more impressive with that early season victory over Louisiana. So following Troy, I've got that heated rivalry there. Troy just barely edging out South Alabama. I know the Jags fans won't like that one much, but they have a very good opportunity. Again, with what I saw on the basketball court yesterday, I don't have a lot of concerns for South Alabama going forward. Now, surprisingly, Louisiana's all the way down here in the 5th spot for me at this point. Again, you start the season 0-2, it's a little hard to put you a whole lot higher than that. I guess you could argue that with their performance last night, maybe you could have listed them above South Alabama as they both 1-1 on the early part of the season there. Again, that was more of a toss-up, but again, leaned on the fact that South Alabama has gotten over the schneid and then lost in overtime versus Louisiana losing 2 in regulation. Followed Louisiana up with Southern Miss, and to include ODU, since they were in the initial ranking, technically it goes from the first 6. I put 7, so I did half the conference, but I put ODU in there. As Trevor is aware, I did take ODU as kind of my dark horse, big surprise for this year. It hurts my heart not to have them on a list like this. So I got to at least list them. But again, they were also listed as 3rd before the season started. So I included them here in this one to show where I think they are at this point, or where they could be getting to, later on. But are they truly that ranking? No, they're definitely not. But again, since they were included in the preseason poll, I tried to kind of consistently keep the same teams in just to kind of re-rank them there before we get out of here. So thank you all for watching and tuning in. I saw the numbers jumping around a little bit as we went on through this, and we will continue to do this. I'd love to see more interaction. Get in here, talk some trash, ask some questions. I'm not the biggest expert on everything, but I just love to get involved with this and follow it along. It makes it a whole lot more fun with the fan interaction. So I appreciate you guys for checking this out, whether it's live or after the fact. Remember that we are sponsored down below by W Energy. You can enter SBS Well, it's SB Syndicate, Sunbelt Syndicate. It's shorthanded SB Syndicate at checkout for your promo code to help you out when you hit that checkout cart for your first order of W Energy. Actually, it'll apply to any order of W Energy that you end up going with. Thank you to Dogs Media Network for allowing us to do this and bring it to you, as well as College Football Dogs. Be on the lookout for this weekend's national championship write-up. Might include a little section from yours truly on the Michigan offense. But thanks for watching, guys, and we'll see you again next week.